4th term as Germany's leader. Germany currently has no laws limiting how many terms a chancellor can serve, and it brings me to my question of the week. Who has been the longest-serving chancellor of Germany since the end of the Second World War? Konrad Adenauer, Kurt Georg Kiesinger, Helmut Kohl, or Angela Merkel? Stay tuned and we'll tell you the correct answer. This week's book of the week is Who Are We? The Challenges to America's National Identity by Sam Huntington. Huntington was a distinguished scholar and my academic advisor. He foresaw in this book the Trump movement and right-wing populist parties everywhere, and more broadly, he foresaw that 21st century politics would not be about ideology, but rather identity. A controversial, fascinating book that will force you to think. And now for the last look. The Houses of Parliament always look stunning on the banks of the River Thames, but they're actually falling apart. A renovation could cost nearly $7 billion. Members of the Houses of Commons and Lords have recommended that the building be vacated for 6 years, which is how long it'll take to complete the work. So, where would the Parliament meet in the meantime? Some parliamentarians suggested nationalizing a nearby pub for the location, but there are proposals that are a little less traditionally British. Take a look at these renderings by the architecture firm Gensler. They call this proposal Project Poseidon because Parliament would be housed not next to the Thames, but on it, literally. The architects say this floating structure would minimize government disruption by keeping it in essentially the same place. The British Parliament told us, however, that they foresee, quote, significant logistical, access and security challenges with a floating option. The last time Parliament was rebuilt after it was bombed by the Nazis, Winston Churchill insisted it be kept smaller than necessary to create the drama of a packed room for important debates. Who knows what inspiration politicians might get if they govern while afloat on the Thames? The correct answer to our GPS challenge question was C, Helmut Kohl. Kohl was chancellor from 1982 to 1998, oversaw the reunification of East and West Germany in 1990. He served for a total of 16 years and 26 days. As for Merkel, Germany's first female chancellor, she's currently serving her 11th year in office. If she wins next year's elections, she could equal Kohl's time in office. Thanks to all of you for being part of my program this week. I will see you next week.
And it's time for Reliable Sources, our weekly look at the story behind the story of how the media really works, how the news gets made. A special welcome to our viewers here in the U.S. and all around the world on CNN International. This hour, hateful groups emboldened by Donald Trump's election. Online opinions moving offline as seen here. So what's the proper way for the press to cover this? I'll talk about it with 3 experts. Plus, did you hear about the news website that saw a 10x spike in donations this month? They are crediting Trump, so I'll ask what they're doing with the money. And later, a big change at the Associated Press. The next editor is here exclusively to talk about the future of the Newswire. But first, let's pause. Seriously. The national news media reported at 100 miles an hour non-stop during this campaign year. The coverage was saturating, overwhelming, exhausting. I remember CNN's John Berman telling me on the morning of Election Day, Brian, sleep now, because you never know what's going to happen after election night. I blew him off, but he was right. I should have slept because the news cycle has sped up even faster this month, covering all things Trump.
Another day, another Twitter tirade from Donald Trump.
Trump tweeted yesterday
to Donald Trump's late-night Twitter tirade.
Here's the Trump tweet. He tweeted, quote,
let's start with these Twitter comments from President-elect Trump. Donald Trump is already tweeting.
Donald Trump spent his early morning on a Twitter rant.
His tweets are the Tom Cruises of tweets. Short and unhinged, but you kind of can't look away.
And now the president-elect is surely going to be a story. But is he always the story? Is there too much focus on Trump the man, too little on his views and policies? Do his inflammatory tweets serve as a distraction? Maybe even something he does on purpose? Here to discuss that and more are 3 A-list guests. Walter Isaacson, president of the Aspen Institute, also the former editor of Time magazine and the head of CNN. Ezra Klein, founder of Vox.com. And Charles Cook, the editor of National Review Online. Great to see all 3 of you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Walter, what are journalists doing wrong in this critical transition period? Do we overreact to every tweet, every flutter from Donald Trump? Because I think sometimes I do.
Maybe so. But look, I think we should stop flagellating ourselves. If Donald Trump tweets, that's newsworthy. At a certain point, he'll have a team in place and we'll have some real policies to cover. At the moment, it is, and he's very much a showman in that. He came out of the reality TV world, so he knows how to make himself the star of his own reality show. And, you know, I think sometimes we wring our hands a bit too much. We're going to have a lot of time once he gets in office to start covering his policies.
All right, Walter's letting me off the hook a little bit, but Ezra, what do you think? I mean, you've seen this sort of day in, day out coverage of Trump, intense coverage. I don't remember it being quite like this with President-elect Obama.
I actually do think it was like this with Obama, except the tenor of the coverage, of course, is very different. Remember, we were in a financial crisis as Obama was coming in. There was a tremendous amount of transition and cabinet announcements. I mean, I remember that as being a very intense time, but it was a more substantive time. Look, I think we do need to do a better job covering Trump's policies. I think that we made a mistake as an industry during the campaign. I think people tended to think of Trump as Peter Thiel liked to put it, and The Atlantic put it before him, try to take him seriously but not literally. I think what we've been seeing since his election is that you actually should have taken him pretty literally. He is nominating the sorts of folks to major positions that you would have expected if you had really listened to what he said and if you had thought that he meant what he said. So I do think something important here, and that we're going to have to begin to do a better job of as he assumes the presidency, is to believe that Trump means what he says and that he will do what he says. Because until we do that, I think we just keep getting led around by tweets and letting him off the hook.
At the same time, he did change some of his positions this week, or at least moderate. Charles, it seemed he talked about climate change when meeting with the New York Times on Tuesday. We've seen some examples of him maybe moderating or softening his positions. What did you make of Trump's visits this week with the media? Going to the New York Times headquarters, also having the heads of 5 of the networks and a lot of anchors come over to Trump Tower on Monday. What are we to make of Trump venting, complaining to the media, even after he won?
Well, I don't think it should be too surprising that he's changed some of his positions to start with, given that throughout the campaign he put forward more than one position on almost every topic. He made himself into something of a Rorschach test. That's one of the ways that he won. It's one of the reasons I was a staunch critic of his. I couldn't quite work out where he was coming from, and I still can't. I'm glad he's speaking to the media. I can't say I was pleased that he dressed down the media, as he seems to have done. But we've seen something of a schizophrenic Trump once again this week. I mean, in the same day, he said that the New York Times was failing, and essentially that it was the jewel in the crown of American journalism.
Right, at the end of the meeting, he was complimenting the New York Times. Ezra, what do you make of that? Were the TV networks wrong to agree to meet off the record with Donald Trump versus the New York Times insisting on an on-the-record interview?
I'm not going to second guess that piece of it, but what I will say is that I think Donald Trump has a very symbiotic relationship with much of the media, and particularly media and release new policy papers. So I do want to be a little bit careful. As Charles says, he often says a lot of different things in interviews, but overall the thrust of his policies has tended to remain pretty consistent, and until he actually changes them, I don't want to give him credit for them having changed.
What do you recommend to the current leadership of CNN and to frankly, to the parent company Time Warner? You know, we're talking about a president-elect who has said he's going to block the pending Time Warner AT&T deal, for example.
Well, I think that's irrelevant to the way CNN should be covering it. I mean, when I was at CNN, I certainly didn't look at all the corporate, Time Warner type things involved, and I know no journalist at CNN would do that. That said, I think that CNN has a pretty easy road to hoe. It's just keep it straight. Okay. Keep it straight. Report what's happening. Even when the president-elect calls in the anchors and executives and then complains about CNN and NBC, complains about news coverage. It's not your job to let that get under your skin. You have things to cover. I think the media landscape, though, has changed so enormously. From the days, even in the 1990s, where there is no one thing as the media. You have everything, from Breitbart to, Twitter accounts and Twitter feeds of different people. So there's no one unified media, and it's not as trustworthy. If I were at CNN, I know what Jeff Zucker and others are doing, which is say, there's a role for somebody you can really trust, who's trying to get it right. Because in the days where you don't know where things are coming from on the internet, you want to say, well, here's a few things I trust. I love what you just
just said, trying to get it right. You know, Charles, there's been so much conversation about fake news in the past couple of months. These websites that try to get it wrong, try to trick people, try to create hoaxes. Is this the year of fake news? Do you think newsrooms are doing enough to combat this?
I don't know what can be done to combat it except to keep trying. I mean, this is one of the downsides to the internet. If the problem with the world, if the problem with our communications, if the problem with the media in the 1950s was that there were too many gatekeepers, and that if you weren't on the right side of, say, 2, 3, 4 people in the country who ran vast corporations, there were 3 television stations, right. The problem now is there are no gatekeepers. Anybody can set up a website, anybody can cause a stir, and if the right people link to it, and there are a lot of right people these days, it's going to become a story. The one thing I think the press can do to stop playing into those people's hands is to slow down a little bit. I mean, Donald Trump is going to need a lot of scrutiny. National Review is on the right, but National Review has given him a great deal of scrutiny thus far and will continue to. But it's very difficult when every single tweet that he puts out or statement he makes is scrutinized, you know, as if it were the Talmud. And I think that if CNN and Fox News corporate types are watching, do slow down, because a lot of people I know on the right who like Trump are already saying, well, they're going to criticize him whatever he does, and that's the point at which they turn to alternative sources.
Do these sites, these fake news sites, do they have a poisoning effect, Ezra, on our conversations?
They're not helping. I am not persuaded. So the fake news trend is a very bad one, and it is particularly a Facebook problem. You're seeing tremendous shares and engagement around this kind of content. This sort of, you know, the Pope Francis endorses Donald Trump pieces, even though that did not happen. But I am not persuaded this is changing minds in a very big way. As much as I do think it's an issue, and as much as I do want to see it solved, I think it's become a slightly convenient excuse for what has happened, for how Donald Trump got elected, because everybody can just agree.
But I'm not here saying that's why Trump was elected. I don't think.
No, I know, but I think that's been the role it's played in a bit of a broader conversation. So
I'm worried about our people opting out of journalism, you know, just choosing not to believe anything. Walter, what do you think?
If you could start from a clean slate now, one of the things you would do, whether it's in terms of cyber hacking or fake news sites or everything else, is say, you got to know where something comes from. People have to take accountability for their own information they put out, and you would end the anonymity that comes with a packet switch network, and you'd say, let's create it so every packet has its origin encoded into it, not just its destination.
So you think that would help at least partly to resolve? Oh yeah,
only partly. People say, well, that wouldn't solve it. But yeah, you would kind of know that there's some Macedonian teenager telling you that the Pope has endorsed, you know, Donald Trump, or this has happened, as opposed to that's a real source of information. And secondly, I think it should encourage people like yourself, people at all the networks, say, you know, if there's one role we can play in the good old-fashioned media, it's at least we try hard to get it right. People say we're biased or et cetera. Sure, their biases creep in. But every morning, you know whether you're trying hard to get it right or trying hard to get it wrong. Right. And there ought to be people saying we're the ones who try hard to get it right.
We've got to do a better job of explaining what we do in this confusing internet and information age. If you could all stick around for me, we're going to take a quick break here. Coming up after the break, hate, harassment on the rise in the U.S., journalists receiving anti-Semitic and racist messages, and we all saw this video from last weekend in Washington. We're going to talk about the proper way to cover this right after the break.